What's going on, guys? We are finally back in the garage after what seems like forever, and we're actually going to be working on a car. Now, we've got some new factory Mazda parts for the 1990 Miata that we just picked up. Nothing too extremely exciting other than we've got a new radio bezel, and if we remember back to the video on this thing, the factory bezel is cracked in about 4 or 5 places. So Mazda still had this thing available from the dealership, was able to go in with my VIN number, order it. So this is gonna make that interior look so much nicer. Next, we've got factory Mazda plug wires. We've got some factory Mazda spark plugs, a factory Mazda air filter because this one has an aftermarket one that's kind of falling apart. And last but not least, a valve cover gasket. Now, this valve cover is not leaking terribly bad. It's just a little bit gooey around the edges, but I've got a friend that has a early Miata, and he was replacing the spark plugs and found one of the spark plug tube seals was leaking. That whole spark plug was swimming in oil, so I figured it would be a good time, since we're doing the plugs and wires, to go ahead and do the valve cover gasket, and it'll kind of be interesting to look under the valve cover. Is it going to be clean because it only has 30,000 miles, or is it going to be nasty and dark because people have hardly ever changed the oil possibly on this car? A lot of people, when they don't drive a car, it will just sit and never get an oil change. So is the oil going to be nasty and dark under there, or is it hopefully going to be nice and clean? So we'll get the valve cover ripped off and see what we find under there. So hopefully it's clean. We'll get the plugs, wires, air filter, valve cover gasket thrown on, and then we'll jump inside, throw that new radio bezel on, and it should be one step closer to being that much nicer of a Miata. Well, guys, I thought we would start with the most boring part first, which is the air filter. Now, this is the factory air filter for at least this 1.6 liter Miata. So we will get this thing unbolted. I had thought about putting a high flow, air filter in this, like I've got in the Camaro. I've got a green filter in the Camaro, but I kind of last minute decided, you know what, this is not some monster high horsepower car. This is just a little Miata. So we would keep it factory fresh and throw a factory replacement filter in it. And again, I'm not really sure if the other one was aftermarket or not, but I figured it would be beneficial to have a new factory one in, so we could be getting as much air through it as possible. This filter is like the gasket's tearing, coming apart, not stuck on it. And yeah, no idea what brand that is. So we got a factory in there, get it bolted back down, and we'll move on to something a little more interesting. Now, one thing I like doing on not just specifically a 4-cylinder, but any vehicle, is taking at least a really good mental note, or actually writing down where all of your spark plug wire to coil locations go. Because if you just were to throw them on 1, 2, 3, 4, you're going to be out of order. You're not going to run right if it even starts. So take a good picture with your phone, whatever, get a picture of where they go and where they correspond to before you rip everything off and then are wondering and scratching your head. So let's start with getting all of these plug wires ripped out of here, and hopefully none of them are full of engine oil. And they are all dry. So at least none of our spark plug tube seals are leaking. But we'll go ahead and throw the new valve cover on anyways, or valve cover gasket, just because we have it. And we are here. We've got a couple of hoses on the side. See if we can get them broken loose. I bet that is the first time these hoses have been off in 30 years. Because they're a little bit stiff. So it looks like we've got some 10mm bolts or nuts. They are bolts, even though they look like nuts. So we'll get these buzzed out. And then it looks like we've got a couple of 12mm bolts here on this coil bracket. And I'm hoping we can just leave that bracket in place, and yeah, it's got enough movement there. So let's see what else we've got here. I believe that is everything. So let's see if we can persuade this ancient valve cover off. Now, are we gonna have a bunch of dirt, sludge, nastiness, or is it gonna be clean? Well, it looks pretty clean. So yeah, it looks relatively clean. Obviously it's not brand new, but the oil sitting in the head is nice and clean. We don't have any sludge, nastiness built up. The cams look clean. So we've probably got a healthy motor here. We should be good to clean up the head surface wherever that valve cover gasket is gonna touch. Obviously at the corners here, we've got a little bit of RTV that we need to get cleaned out so we can get some fresh to go back in. And I'm just using a small little flat blade screwdriver to kind of help persuade that old RTV out of place without scratching the aluminum. So now that we've got all the old RTV cleaned out of those corners, we'll go ahead and wipe the mating surface so we can make sure that new valve cover gasket has the best chance it can on actually sealing. And like I said, this one wasn't leaking bad. It just was a little bit gooey kind of on some of the edges. And I figured since we had the plugs and wires and everything else off, it would be a good time to get a fresh gasket on this thing, since it probably is original to the vehicle. So we also need to get the new valve cover gasket put in to the valve cover. And it honestly still feels nice and rubbery. Sometimes these things get super old, brittle, hard as a rock. This one still honestly feels nice. So for all I know, it's been replaced before, but it doesn't feel in too terrible shape at least. So out with the old. We will clean it up just a little bit. And again, here is that part number for the factory valve cover gasket for a 1.6. So we'll get this thing pressed back into the grooves. So now one thing we do need to do, we removed all of the old RTV engine sealant from these corners. We need to add some new. This is just some 3-bond, which is also an RTV engine sealant type material. It just is kind of handy to apply. We'll get it on both of our front joints up here by the cam and also at the back. And now we should be ready to dip this valve cover back into place. And just like that, we should be ready to now start bolting it back down. And now for removal, I had used a impact, and which is great, lots of power, pulls it off quick and easy. But install, I'm gonna be running a ratchet. Now, a little easier to control the power since these bolts are small. But as you can see, the Milwaukee stuff makes really quick work of it. So Milwaukee, hey, hit me up. I use your stuff a lot. All of our bolts back in. and then we'll start tightening it up. And traditionally, you'd kind of start from the middle and work your way out to kind of spread it out evenly. There's probably, obviously, a torque spec and a torque sequence, but we're gonna take our best judgment on this thing and just go ahead and start from the middle, work our way out, and tighten it down. Now I am gonna take kind of a final go through with a normal ratchet just to make sure everything's where it needs to be. And obviously those center ones that we tightened up first are now loose since the rest of the valve cover tightened down. So that's why you go back through and double check everything. Let's get these couple of hoses thrown back on. So now that we've got that valve cover all bolted down, we'll go ahead and yank out these spark plugs, which are probably maybe original. See how they look. They were outrageously tight. And honestly, they are either replaced or in outrageously good shape. So like I said, those either have been replaced or somehow look brand new. So here are those new factory Mazda plugs from the dealership per this VIN number. So we will open these up and see what we've got, because these that I just pulled out are NGK plugs that, like I said, look very nice and new. But let's see what should have been in it, or at least what is. And again, yeah, it's an NGK. So I'm gonna guess they've been replaced, or Miatas are really, really nice on their spark plugs, because those that we pulled out look really nice. So like I said, we probably could have not replaced them, but we're already here. We're putting everything new in it, so we might as well at least know for peace of mind that they've been replaced and they are fresh and what they're supposed to be. We'll get them snugged down with the ratchet, and then we'll go final torque with a hand ratchet. You're wanting to tighten them down to get that crush washer at least crushed. And again, there's obviously a real torque spec, but working in the business for a long time, you at least get a feel for what they need to be and hopefully get them close. Now that we've got those plugs in, we are going to throw those fresh Mazda plug wires on. Again, there is that part number for those factory plug wires. And like the RX-7, I've got factory plug wires on that. The factory plug wires are kind of cool because they are all marked with, you know, the correct spot for the plug, so you don't have to guess. Obviously, this is a 4-cylinder, not terribly hard to guess and check which one goes where, but you do have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the rotary it was really nice because they've got leading and trailing 1, 2 marked on each one. So we are going to get these plug wires thrown in, pushed on until you feel it click, and move on to the next. And those are really, really tight fitting, which is good, I guess, because they aren't going to fall off, but they are really tight. And again, hopefully you took a picture or drew a little diagram so you know exactly where the plugs, wires need to be routed so you can get them in the right location. So that gets our valve cover gasket, plugs, plug wires done. And now we're ready to jump into the interior and throw our radio bezel in.